YouTube vinyl community, Rolling Stones fans, random people on the internet, my name is Giggens, and we are here today to talk about the 1967 album from the Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesties Request. A lot has been said about this album being either a complete rip-off of Sgt. Pepper, or being too indulgent of the times, or being the biggest misstep the Stones ever had, being a little blues band that they were. But I think, probably being alive at the time, this may have been like, what the heck is this from the Rolling Stones? That said, 50 years have gone by. This has since been reissued a couple of times. Most recently, a few months ago with a big box set. No bonus tracks. But this album, I think, deserves a real careful examination because not only do I think it's not a complete ripoff of Sgt. Pepper, bar for a couple of things, I really think it's the Stones' last big hurrah in trying to fit in at the time with some other bands before completely abandoning all of that and just going right back to straight up rock and roll and then continuing that streak for many, many years. So, this album's creation happened almost entirely over 1967. In early 67 in February, Mick and Keith were busted at Keith's house called Redlands with all kinds of drugs that were involved there, and they were pretty knocked out. Apparently, there was a tip from a newspaper called The News of the World, and it was a setup, and the whole thing was just a mess. Basically, they got busted and spent a lot of 1967 in court and on trial. And so this album was put together basically in between court sessions and then whatever Rolling Stone felt like showing up at the studio that day. They were pretty fractured at this point. And even their manager, Andrew Luke Oldham, left like in the summer of 67. He couldn't take it anymore. And I think the Stones were also kind of egging him on, trying to get rid of him too. I think they felt like they weren't getting what they wanted out of the sounds and the style they were trying to go for, and Andrew wasn't feeling it, so I think it was a bit of a back and forth between the two of them. That said, yeah, this album comes at a time in their career where they had been experimenting with more and more sounds, really starting with Aftermath and the singles around that time, like Paint It Black, and then what else was around that time? 19th Nervous Breakdown, and then eventually like Let's Spend the Night Together, stuff like that, Under My Thumb. Aftermath brought on instruments that they hadn't been playing with before. I mean, for most of their albums before that, it had been just straight up blues rock. Guitar, bass, drums, vocals, that's it. And all of a sudden on Paint It Black, here we have sitar. Then we have like different mandolins and this harpsichord. Then Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby has like this explosive brass section on it. So they were playing with different textures and seeing what they can do. A lot of it may have been a direct correlation to trying to keep up with other bands. I mean, by the time Aftermath came out, that was like their first fully self-penned album. Every song on that thing was by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, so there were no covers on that one. And they wanted to keep that theme up, I think, throughout the rest of their albums after that, minus a single here or two, or a cover here and there. But for the most part, they were experimenting with new things. When Between the Buttons came out, they had slowly started to experiment with a different kind of psychedelia. I'd even call like She Smiled Sweetly kind of a trippy song. Completely unlike things they had done before, especially having just come off Aftermath with songs like Flight 505 or Going Home, or, like these just classic blues structures. Here they are doing something kind of weird with organs and different, harpsichords and dulcimer and all kinds of stuff. So that came out in January of '67, and then basically 1 month later, all the crap started going down. And so throughout the rest of the year, this thing was pieced together on and off, and it just got trippier and trippier as they went along. I think they started with She's a Rainbow and Citadel and 2000 Light Years, and then the rest of the songs after that continued to get freakier and freakier. To the point where at the end they realized they felt like they had enough songs and that was it, and then they put it out. It's one of their, track listing wise, it's only got 10 songs, which is one of their shortest ones they had done yet. And it was their first album to be released worldwide with the same track listing, almost the same cover, inside and out. In different countries, I think they just called it the Rolling Stones, or they called it the Rolling Stones something else. They dropped the satanic theme because a lot of countries thought, this sounds bad. Satan is bad. Let's not have that on our albums. So they got together with a guy called Michael Cooper, and they went to New York, and they built like a set, and they made this album cover. And the original one, this is an original too, but the first run of them had a lenticular cover, and so it was a 3D image, and so when you turned it like this, their faces would turn, they'd look at each other and move their hands and stuff. Because of that, it was super expensive to produce, and ABKCO was like, we are not putting money behind that. That is way too bloody expensive. So they did this, just a flat matte finish, and put it out. The lenticular cover is actually a bigger picture on the sides, so you get the other Beatles. So on this one, you only get George and John. The bigger lenticular version, you get Paul over here and Ringo over here as well. So in that sense, all 4 Beatles are on the album cover. In this sense, only 2 of them are, but that was a direct response to the Welcome Rolling Stones sweater on the doll on Sgt. Pepper. Beyond that, I also think this cover is completely different from Sgt. Pepper. Yes, the theme is there, the image is there, them wearing costumes, sure. But this album cover is slightly spooky and kind of terrifying, whereas Sgt. Pepper is kind of like this classy, I wouldn't call it family-oriented, theme or something, but it's got this image to it that you feel comfortable looking at it, and you're not, like, afraid of it. This album cover, like the lighting in the picture and the goofy colors and the weird cutout collage stuff, is trippy. It's weird. It looks probably like acid. But I love their expressions on the cover. You got Charlie, looks like he's thoroughly enjoying himself. He's having a fun day dressing up. Keith, I don't think he knows where he is. Mick looks pissed off. Brian is completely out of it. And Bill looks totally uncomfortable with the whole thing. Which he kind of was, his one song on here that he wrote, which is like, I think the only album to feature a vocal and a song by Bill on any Stones album, In Another Land. He basically wrote it as like, hey, this era of our band kind of sucks right now. No one's here in the studio with me. I'm just going to write a song about what's going on and have my friends from the Small Faces come in, Ronnie Lane and Steve Marriott, and we're just going to make a song together. That's kind of what they did. This album was originally going to be called Cosmic Christmas, which I think would have been an awesome name too, but they went with their Satanic Majesties request, which was like a play on Her Majesty's request. It says on the passport in Britain. Peaked at number 3 in the UK, peaked at number 2 in the US, and went gold, but then it dropped really fast off the charts. Yeah. So, on the outside, this album has been criticized as being a cheap Sgt. Pepper ripoff for like 50 years. I don't see it as that. My whole feeling about this album, whereas with Sgt. Pepper, it was 1 foot in the surreal, 1 foot in normal everyday life. So you have songs like Good Morning, Good Morning, A Day in the Life, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, and even just this song, Sgt. Pepper. I mean, you have this, like, very, very loose concept. It's only held together by, like, a reprise at the end of the album of Sgt. Pepper, again, to make it feel like you've been here, you've seen all these acts that are part of this play, this stage routine. But John Lennon even famously said any of those songs could have been on any album. He didn't really feel like they were Sgt. Pepper-type songs. Whereas with this album, part of it does feel like they were probably just super high and got to the recording studio and messed around and did whatever they wanted, which several tracks on here are like that. But there are themes on this album throughout a lot of the songs that I feel do make it slightly coherent. Maybe even a little more so than Sgt. Pepper, whereas Pepper has really great timeless songs on it that do stand apart from each other on their own. This album feels like a group of ideas. A lot of this album really is about thinking about the future and playing in a sci-fi world. And a lot of the music on here is a motive of that. A lot of the strings have that weird sci-fi 50s B-movie approach to really conjure up feelings of a futuristic environment. And there's songs on here about the future, like 2000 Man or Citadel, In Another Land, The Lantern. I mean, it's all about kind of a futuristic approach. Instead of being like internal and at the time psychedelic, they're almost thinking about the future. It's almost like this is like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, but put to music. You can see them being in another land with these weird-looking people and these pretty flowers and stuff. Like you get that vibe from this album. So yeah, with that, let's just kind of jump into this thing, because I think it's a really weird album and it definitely sticks out in the Stones' discography. But because of that, I'm gonna be that guy and say it's one of my favorite Stones albums. I think because it's so un-Rolling Stones, it makes it that much more them. They were about rock and roll and the whole image of doing what they wanted and not following the rules and, you know, making their own path. Yeah, maybe a couple of ideas may have been lifted from the times, but everyone was doing that. Everyone was getting psychedelic. A lot of the old blues players like Muddy Waters put out Electric Mud. Some of the pop stars were putting out slightly trippier songs. Even the Monkees ended up doing like a totally weird album called Head. Like, it was just the times. And so I think, looking back now, it's easy to be like, okay, this is just a Sgt. Pepper ripoff. Here they are in their costumes. Here's the cover. It's trippy. It's the Rolling Stones. I think if I had been there at the time, you would have been able to see everybody else doing things like this. You know, Jimi Hendrix was blowing up. Cream was out. Pink Floyd's first album came out. I mean, like, the whole summer of '67 is an explosive time of psychedelic music. And for the most part, the Stones weren't part of it. They put out their We Love You song with a video to kind of mock what was going on with their own court trials. Beyond that, they were pretty quiet. I mean, and that's why in America, the Flowers album came out. It was just a compilation of, like, random B-sides and unreleased tracks and a couple of singles that had already been out to appease the American market because nothing had come out with the Rolling Stones name on it since earlier that year with Between the Buttons. So, '67 was a quiet year for them for... It's kind of a drag to think of that because that was such a humongous year for pop music. Monterey Pop Festival. I mean, like, everything was exploding at this time. But a lot of bands were changing. A lot of bands were doing different things. I mean, look at the Beach Boys. I mean, they were trying a whole different slew of things when Smile fell apart. So, anyways, this album starts up with a song called Sing This All Together, and it's literally like a group vocal. Like, there's just a gang chorus on this thing throughout the entire song, and I think it's got a really well-executed melody. I think the performance is fun and lively. You know, coming off the other Stones albums, when you're just doing straightforward blues rock, you kind of get the point after a while. So it's kind of fun to see them explore new realms and new themes and different ideas to show that they were deeper than just being a blues band. And there's nothing wrong with that either, but it's kind of fun to see them playing with different textures and see what they can do outside of their norm. That's what rock and roll's about to me. On the outside, that song sounds kind of simple, but really I think it's well done. I think it's a great opening track and kind of gives you an idea of the approach that they wanted to slightly abandon with their old sound and try something completely far out. So, the next song, Citadel, this does sound like a classic Rolling Stones song, but if they were completely done up on acid. So, it sounds like they're out of their minds. It's got this big splashy guitar, cymbal thing going on. There's harpsichords, there's maracas. It just sounds like a full-on LSD jam. Big rock riffs on this thing, you know, it's just a jam the whole time. Really groovy kind of stuff. I really like that song a lot. In Another Land, I talked about this one a little bit before. This is Bill Wyman's, I think, one and only song and one and only lead vocal on a Rolling Stones album, which leave it to this weirdo album to have his only take on there, his only lead. This song has really great vocal effects on it, real trippy sort of like revolving Leslie speaker kind of, you know, kind of voice stuff. You know what that sounds like. I mean, the song even ends with Bill snoring at the end because it was a response to him feeling bored or annoyed by this weird trend that the Stones were going through at this time. It's almost got like a bit of a Syd Barrett approach to it. I really get a Syd Barrett feel, especially from Bill's vocal, but also from the gang vocals that come up during the chorus, and it almost sounds like She's a Rainbow in parts, which I think is pretty cool. 2000 Man, I love the folk rock guitars in this thing, the futuristic story vibe about alienation, isolation, not fitting in, trying to relate to a future where you came from a past that the future won't understand you or listen to you or care. You know, there's lots of songs about that kind of setup. I think there's a great song by Montreal that reminds me of that called Old People in the Cemetery. And there's a line that goes, it must be hard to relate when the world of your youth totally evaporates. And that line reminds me of this song. I think the two go hand in hand really well. Kiss did a version of this song for a little while. Sing This All Together and See What Happens is basically just a curious jam based off of the opening track. And there's, you know, the thing I'll give this album a lot of credit for is it branches into outsider territory, outsider music territory, where there's a lot of found music, found samples, you know, random bits of sound effects and just people talking and random conversations that hadn't really been done yet. I mean, Simon and Garfunkel will do it with their song Silent Night. what was it, Bookends, where it's just like, war stories on the news. And so that's kind of, I can see a relation there. But these sound effect things pop up throughout the entire album, and I think that gives it a weird texture that other bands weren't really playing with. This song, though, really does feel like filler to me. It's just kind of like stoned mumbling. There's screaming, there's yelling. They do mention the sing this all together phrase over and over again at one point. Lots of fun percussion on this song, though. I'll give this album a lot of credit. There's some great bongo work. There's some great like maracas and shakers and clicky sticks and all kinds of stuff. Claves, whatever they call them. So I like a lot of that stuff. Side 2 opens with She's a Rainbow, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs of the 60s, let alone by the band the Rolling Stones. Beautiful melody, catchy, wonderful, trippy Stones. This album version opens with the intro of, more sound effects, more people talking, and then blasts into this great, really delicate, flowery piano, I think played by Nicky Hopkins, who was around the band a lot back in those days. The piano is actually absolutely amazing. I think the horns are great. I think it's their most focused song on the album so far, which is funny because I think that was the first one they recorded. So like it was just downhill from there. I love the acoustic guitar. I love the la 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 vocals in the background. Their flavor when they add the acoustic guitar to their songs is very Rolling Stones. The strumming pattern, the riffing, the phrasing. You know it's got that churning rhythmic vibe that only they can produce. Yeah, great song. It was a single. They've played it live a handful of times. I think it's one of the best moments on the album. Absolute smash of a song. The Lantern. This is a very cool song. For me, it's got a No Expectations vibe off of Beggar's Banquet. It kind of plods along, but I really like the feel that it goes for and the storytelling that they develop. Mixed voice, I think, on this song is fantastic. Yeah, that's about it for that one. Gomper. Again, this is kind of another like jammy filler piece. Really angry flute happening on this thing. There's tabla, there's organ, there's sitar and bongos. More jamming trippiness. So I'm not sure if that was just meant to be, a fun night for them to hang out and record something and put on the album, or if there was like a direction to it. But it does feel a bit directionless. 2,000 Light Years from Home is a freaking great song. I mean, the maraca shaking that leads this track throughout the whole thing is fantastic. It's got this great guitar riff going on, and it's got the trippy, emotive, sci-fi strings that happen all over this thing. Oh yeah, and the strings on She's a Rainbow were by John Paul Jones. I forgot to mention that, of Led Zeppelin. This song, 2,000 Light Years from Home, they have played this before too. I think it's one of the strongest songs on the album. I mean, the imaging, again, it's more of this futuristic sci-fi stuff. Really cool. And then the album ends with a song called On With The Show, which is like a slightly vaudevillian, put-on voice that Mick is doing about stepping right up to a magical mystery show. And, lots of bubbly pianos, again, more sound effects, and, random bits of people talking to create this illustration of a psychedelic experience. So yeah, this album as a whole was recorded throughout February and October really sporadically because of these court trials and everything else. And it's funny because with all of that broken up time, a lot of their albums were recorded when they were on the road and in different places. So most of this album was recorded in one place when they weren't touring. And it's funny because to me personally, I think it's one of their most focused albums of originals. Their earlier albums when they're doing blues songs, I think are great. But as far as originals go, this is a start in the right direction to what would eventually become some of their best work of their career. So this album in particular, to me, feels like a grand send-off, where they had been following the Beatles here and there in bits and pieces, especially with the sitar use or whatever, or having their manager say, hey, you should write some songs because other bands are doing it and they make more money, so you guys should do that too. But in doing that, it brought out their own strengths and their own magic and their own flavor. So, when this album came out, a lot of people were confused by it and thought it was a cheap ripoff, but it's not. It's of its time. Everyone got psychedelic. It's just what happened. Even the Beatles dropped the whole psychedelic thing. People forget that, yeah, Sgt. Pepper was completely psychedelic too, and they hadn't been doing that before either. So, it was of its time. And then they dropped it with their next album, with the White Album, or Magical Mystery Tour, but that was still 67. I mean, the White Album's a complete departure from psychedelic. And the next album the Stones put out, Beggars Banquet, same deal. They completely, I think they tossed in the towel saying, like, you know what, I don't care, we don't care what other bands are doing. We're going to do our own thing. We're on our own now. We've produced our own album. We know we can do this. And Beggars Banquet spawned some of the most amazing songwriting of their career and continued throughout Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street. Like, they made some amazing albums after that, really becoming the Rolling Stones. You know, they stopped following everyone else because it's only rock and roll and they like it. So that's what they went with. So for me, this album was like a grand explosion of like, see you later, this is us, you know, trying this far out stuff. It didn't work. Who cares? Let's go make Beggars Banquet now. So, yeah, that's probably all I have to say about this. Kind of a long video, but I think this album deserves a second chance. You know, people have been saying that more and more lately because of the reissue of this thing that just came out. And here's the inside. I love the collage work on this thing. Very, very cool. And this maze over here, actually, you can't get inside. There's like actually a stop at some point that stops you from getting to the inside of the maze. My copies, unfortunately, is a little bit beat up, as you can see by the split there, but it's insanely hard to find this album. Like, you don't come across this thing. The lenticular version of it, be prepared to spend like $400 bucks. I guess they kind of did copy the Beatles with the, you know, inner sleeve a little bit. This is a stereo copy on London Records. So there you go. I mean, you know, it's funny to think like this was the Stones' offering at the end of '67, and for most people, what they were hearing well into '68 until Beggars Banquet came out, and it was a complete departure from this thing. So this album kind of got left behind in the dust for a long time, and the Stones themselves don't talk about this thing with any sort of fondness beyond like, yeah, we were pretty high. We made a fun album for a little bit. Mick Jagger in the early '80s even called this a comedy album. He was like, yeah, we would never do that kind of funny stuff now. So, there you go. Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesties request. Personally, I do think it's one of my favorite Stones albums, only because it's so freaking weird and so un-Rolling Stones. But there's nothing else that sounds like this. It sounds like the Rolling Stones doing psychedelic music. Whereas Sgt. Pepper has this real tight production. This thing's got a real loose, I don't want to use the word flimsy production, but it's got that loose R&B blues style infused with psychedelic. So in one respect, they made something that sounds completely original because nothing else sounds like this. There you go. I'm going to give this thing an 8 out of 10. I think it's a great album, but the filler songs on here, like Sing This All Together and Gomper, well, they're fun to listen to. If they had put a couple more really strong tracks in there, this album could have been absolute magic. So, there you go. Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesties request, 1967. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Giggens. This has been Album Reviews, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.